My son-in-law looked me dead in the eye at the breakfast table, my own son, standing right there saying nothing, and said, "Frank, you've been here 8 months. Either start pulling your weight financially, or I'll help you find a facility that can take better care of you." I did not answer him. I picked up my coffee mug, took one slow sip, set it back down on the table, folded my napkin, and walked upstairs to my room, or what they called my room. It was 9 feet by 10, squeezed between the water heater and a wall of storage shelves still holding Danny's old baseball trophies and a box of Christmas ornaments his wife never bothered to unpack. I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at the wall, and I thought about Ruth. Ruth would have known what to say. She always did. 39 years of marriage, and the woman never once raised her voice, but she could cut through noise like a knife through warm butter. She'd have walked back down those stairs, poured herself a cup of coffee, sat across from Craig, and said something so quiet and so precise that he'd have spent the next 3 days trying to figure out what had just happened to him. That was Ruth. But Ruth had been gone 14 months, and I was sitting in a 9 by 10 room between a water heater and Danny's baseball trophies, trying to remember who I was before all of this. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 67 years old. For 31 years, I worked as a licensed master electrician for Harmon Industrial Services out of Columbus, Ohio. I built a house with my own hands, not entirely, but enough. I wired every room myself. I knew where every junction box was, every breaker, every run of conduit behind those walls. Ruth and I raised Danny in that house. We paid it off in full by the time he was in high school. We were not rich people, but we were solid, careful people. We had a plan for everything. The plan did not include Ruth dying of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon in October while she was deadheading the roses in the backyard. She was 62 years old. She hadn't even been sick. I found her just after 4 o'clock. The paramedics came. The neighbors stood on their lawns watching. By 8 that evening, a doctor I'd never met in my life sat across from me in a waiting room and told me she was gone. Danny drove down from Cincinnati that same night. He and his wife Renee arrived just after midnight, and he held me in the driveway in the dark for a long time without saying anything. That meant everything to me in that moment. I thought, my son is here. I thought, I am not alone. The funeral was a Thursday. Danny handled the arrangements. He picked the casket, chose the flowers, coordinated with the pastor. I was so hollowed out that I let him. I stood at the graveside in a gray suit I hadn't worn since his cousin's wedding, and I watched them lower Ruth into the ground on a cold October morning, and I understood for the first time in my life that I did not know how to be a person without her. In the weeks that followed, Danny called every day. He and Renee drove up twice. They cleaned out the refrigerator, stocked it with food I wouldn't eat, left casseroles in the freezer. Renee was efficient about it. She moved through the house with purpose, organizing things, labeling containers, writing notes, and sticking them to the cabinet doors. I watched her do it, and I told myself she was being kind. I told myself I was lucky to have a daughter-in-law who cared enough to come. It was Danny who brought up the house first. We were sitting at the kitchen table in late November. He'd driven up alone that time. He looked serious in the way he used to look when he wanted something from me as a teenager. Careful, measured, building up to the point from a distance. He said, "Dad, have you thought about what you want to do? With the house, I mean. Long term." I told him I hadn't thought much about anything yet. He said he understood. He said he wasn't trying to push me, but he said that the property taxes alone were going to be a burden on my fixed income, and that the house was big for one person, and that they had the space in Cincinnati, the guest room downstairs, and that maybe just for a while I might consider selling and coming to stay with them until I figured out my next step. I want to be honest about this part, because I've had a lot of time since then to think about it clearly. Danny wasn't wrong about the taxes. He wasn't wrong that the house was big for one person. A 4-bedroom house in a Columbus suburb with a yard I'd need to maintain. On a pension of $1,400 a month plus my Social Security, it was tight. I knew it was tight. What I didn't think clearly enough about was the sequence of things. I was still in grief. I was sleeping 4 hours a night. I was eating crackers and peanut butter for dinner because cooking in that kitchen without Ruth felt like something I wasn't allowed to do yet. Danny said all the right things at exactly the right moment. I sold the house in February. The market was good. After paying off the remaining balance and closing costs, I cleared just over $180,000. Danny was there for the closing. On the drive back, he suggested gently that it might make sense to put half the proceeds into a joint account to cover my expenses while I was staying with them, my portion of utilities, groceries, any care needs that might come up. He made it sound like bookkeeping. He made it sound practical. I transferred $90,000 into a joint account with my son. I kept $90,000 in my own savings. I had my pension. I had my Social Security, $940 a month. I thought I was being reasonable. I thought I was contributing fairly to a household that was taking me in. I moved into the 9x10 room in March. The first month was fine. Quiet, but fine. I had breakfast with Danny before he left for work. Renee was friendly in the mornings. Their two kids, Marcus, who was 11, and Lily, who was 8, were glad to have their grandfather around. I helped Marcus with a school project about electrical circuits. I read to Lily at night when she asked me to. I felt, cautiously, like maybe this could work. The shift was so gradual I almost didn't notice it at first. It started with small things. Renee began leaving a notepad on the kitchen counter with a running tally. A log of expenses, she said, was to keep things transparent. Groceries. A portion of the gas bill. My share of the streaming subscriptions. I didn't object. I paid what she listed. In cash. Every 2 weeks. Then she started mentioning my medications. I take a daily blood pressure medication and a low-dose statin. Nothing dramatic. Nothing expensive. My Medicare Part D covered most of it. But Renee started referring to my medical costs in conversation, as though they were a significant item in the household budget, which they were not. She'd say things like, "We really do need to think about the expense of having someone with health needs in the house." I'm not even sure Danny heard those comments the way I heard them. He had a talent for being present in a room without really listening to it. By May, the dynamic in the house had shifted in ways I couldn't fully name, but felt very clearly every morning. Renee no longer said good morning to me directly. She'd walk into the kitchen, speak to Danny, speak to the kids, pour her coffee, and leave. I was present in the room the way a piece of furniture is present, acknowledged only when inconvenient. The account. That became the thing. The joint account Danny and I had set up for my expenses somewhere around month 3. He told me it made more sense for him to manage it directly, that it was simpler with his online banking setup. I agreed to this. I don't know why I agreed to it. I think I was still trying to be easy. Still trying not to be a burden. Still trying to earn my place in that house the way you earn your place somewhere when you know you don't fully belong. By June, $90,000 had quietly become something I had no practical access to. I asked Danny about it once. Directly, at the kitchen table, on a Saturday morning when Renee had taken the kids to a soccer game. I said, "Danny, I want to understand where we are with the account. Can we sit down and go through the numbers?" He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not angry. Something quieter than angry. He said, "Dad, you're not exactly contributing to this household. You're retired. Renee works full-time, I work full-time. The account is basically covering what it costs to have you here. We're doing the math every month." I asked him to show me the math. He said he would. He never did. I stopped asking. I want you to understand what that kind of silence does to a person. Not the loud abuse I've heard people describe situations far worse than mine. Situations with shouting and cruelty and real danger. What I experienced was the quiet kind. The kind that makes you question whether you're being mistreated at all or whether you're just difficult, just demanding, just old and unable to adapt. Every morning I woke up in that 9x10 room and I had the same argument with myself. Am I being reasonable or am I being naive? In July, Danny and Renee hosted a dinner party. 6 of their friends, a long table in the dining room, nice wine, a catered pasta dish that Renee had ordered from a restaurant downtown. I came downstairs around 6:30. not realizing the guests had already arrived, and walked into a room full of conversation that stopped when I appeared. Renee turned to me with a smile that was perfectly calibrated. She said, "Frank, we have company. Do you mind eating in the kitchen tonight?" One of the guests, a woman I'd never met, looked at me with an expression I still think about. Not pity. Something more careful than pity. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you've just understood something about a situation that you wish you hadn't. I said, "Of course." I made myself a sandwich. I ate it at the kitchen counter while laughter came through the wall. That night, lying on the bed in my room, I asked myself the question I had been avoiding since March. Not am I being mistreated? I knew the answer to that. The real question was, what am I waiting for? And I didn't have a good answer. I think I was waiting for Danny to become the person he'd been in that driveway in October. I was waiting for the son who had held me without saying anything because he understood that nothing needed to be said. I kept looking for him in the house and not finding him. And instead of accepting that he wasn't there anymore or maybe had never been exactly who I thought, I kept waiting. August came. The heat was bad that summer in Cincinnati. I spent most of my mornings on the back porch because the house felt smaller every week. One morning in the third week of August, I got a phone call from an old colleague named Paul Yetter. We'd worked together at Harmon for almost 20 years, and he'd gone on to start his own electrical contracting business in Dayton after he retired from the company. He was calling to catch up, and somewhere in the conversation he mentioned he'd taken on a contract for a large commercial renovation project and was drowning in the inspection and compliance work. He said, half joking, "I don't suppose you'd want to come consult for a few months? I'd pay you well. You know the code better than anybody I ever worked with." I told him I'd think about it. I hung up and I sat on the back porch for a long time. 2 days later at breakfast, Craig, that's Renee's father, who had come to visit for a week and had apparently been briefed thoroughly on the household situation, looked across the table and said to me, "So Frank, Renee tells me you've been retired for what, 5 years now? Don't you think a man your age ought to either be contributing to this household or looking into assisted living? There are really good facilities these days. Nothing to be ashamed of." Danny was sitting right there. He looked at his plate. I looked at Craig for a long moment. I looked at my son, and I understood, with a clarity I hadn't felt since Ruth died, exactly what kind of situation I was in, and exactly what I needed to do about it. I said, "Excuse me." I went upstairs. I took out the mid-sized suitcase from under the bed, the one I'd packed when Ruth and I drove to New England for our 35th anniversary, the last real trip we ever took together. I began folding clothes into it. Methodically, one item at a time. I called Paul Yetter back. I told him I wasn't thinking about it anymore. I told him I was in. He asked when I could start, and I said the following Monday. He said he'd set up a workspace for me, and we'd talk contract terms when I got there. He mentioned a number that was more per week than my combined pension and Social Security for the entire month. Then I called my old neighbor in Columbus, a man named George Abrams, who had lived 3 houses down from Ruth and me for 22 years. George was 71, widowed himself, and had been after me for over a year to come stay in his spare room while I figured things out. I had said no every time because I didn't want to be a burden to anyone. I had said no because I thought Danny's house was the right answer. I called George and told him I was finally taking him up on it. He said, "It's about time, Frank. I'll have the room ready." The next morning was a Friday. I came downstairs with my suitcase at 7:15. Danny was at the kitchen table. Renee was pouring coffee. Marcus and Lily were eating cereal. Everyone looked up. No one spoke. I set the suitcase down by the door. I went to the refrigerator, poured myself a glass of orange juice, and drank it standing at the counter. Then I put the glass in the sink, and I turned around and I looked at my son. I said, "Danny, I love you. I have loved you your entire life, and I will love you until the last day of mine. But I need you to understand something before I walk out this door." He started to say something. I held up one hand. I said, "You are going to have to live with the choices you made in this house for a long time. I don't say that to hurt you. I say it because I know you. And I know the part of you that is better than this. I raised that part of you. I hope you find it again. I picked up my suitcase. Renee said, Frank, let's not be dramatic. We can sit down and… I said, I'm not being dramatic, Renee. I'm leaving. I walked to the front door. I opened it. Marcus had gotten up from the table. He was standing in the hallway looking at me with big eyes. I crouched down, old knees and all, and I said, Hey buddy, you've got a good brain. Don't let anybody make you feel small for using it, okay? He nodded. He looked like he might cry. I said, I'll call you. I walked out. I stood on the porch for a moment in the morning air, and I felt something I had not felt in 8 months in that house. I felt like myself. I felt like Frank Calloway, master electrician, 31 years on the job, man who built a life with his hands and raised a son and loved a woman for 39 years and survived losing her. I felt like that person, standing on that porch, suitcase in hand, on a Friday morning in late August. George's car was already in the driveway. He'd driven up from Columbus the night before without telling me, just in case, he said later. Because that was George. I walked to the car and he popped the trunk and neither of us said much of anything. As we pulled out of the neighborhood, I looked in the side mirror. Danny was standing at the front door. He wasn't saying anything. He was just standing there, watching the car go. And he had an expression on his face that I recognized even from a distance. It was the same expression he'd worn at 16 when I came home and found he'd wrecked my truck on the back road by the reservoir. Not anger, not defiance, just the pale, quiet look of someone who has done something they cannot undo and who knows it. I turned back to face the road. The consulting work with Paul started the following Monday. The project was a commercial building renovation in Dayton, an old manufacturing complex being converted to mixed-use development, 6 floors, complicated systems, real work, the kind of work I had always loved, the kind of problem that requires you to think and plan and adapt, where every decision has consequences downstream and you have to see 5 steps ahead before you touch anything. I drove to the site that first morning at 6:45, and I put on my hard hat, and I walked the floors for 2 hours with a clipboard, making notes, and I felt 20 years younger. Not literally, my knees were still bad, and the coffee from the site trailer was terrible, but in the way that matters. I felt occupied. I felt useful. I felt like someone doing the work he was built to do. Within 3 weeks, Paul had expanded my contract to include 2 additional projects. The rate we'd agreed on, already more than I'd expected, came with a bonus structure tied to passing inspections. We passed the first inspection on the Dayton project in late September without a single citation. Paul took me to dinner and told me he should have called me a year ago. I stayed in George's spare room through October. Clean, simple, good. We ate breakfast together most mornings. George was a retired school principal, and he had the same talent Ruth had, the ability to say the right thing without too many words around it. Some nights we sat on the back porch after dinner and didn't say much of anything, and that was enough. In November, I found an apartment in Dayton, about 8 minutes from the main project site. 1 bedroom, 2nd floor. Good light. I paid the deposit with my own money, from my own account. I bought a used couch and a kitchen table and a coffee maker. And on the first night I slept there, I lay in the dark for a while and took inventory of my life. 67 years old. Licensed master electrician. Consulting on 3 active projects. Own apartment. Social Security and pension, both coming in untouched. $90,000 in savings that no one had access to but me. I was going to be fine. I had to address the other account. The joint account where my $90,000 had gone. I want to be honest here too. I did not handle this the way I might have if I'd been less exhausted, less raw. I hired an attorney in Columbus. It took 6 weeks and 2 uncomfortable phone calls with Danny, but the money was returned. All of it. Danny didn't fight it. I think some part of him was relieved to have the thing resolved cleanly, or maybe he just needed to see that I was serious. He called me in December. He asked if we could meet. We had dinner at a restaurant halfway between Columbus and Cincinnati, just the 2 of us, and we talked for 3 hours. I will not say it was a good dinner, or that everything was resolved, or that Danny was the person I'd raised him to be and had somehow lost. What I will say is that it was honest. More honest than we'd been with each other in a long time. Maybe more honest than we'd ever been. He said he was sorry. He said it several times in several ways. And I believe he meant it. He said Renee and he had been under a lot of financial pressure. I hadn't known about a business loan, a refinancing, pressure that had made him look at everything around him as a potential resource. He said that did not excuse anything. He said he knew that. I told him I wasn't ready to tell him everything was fine, because it wasn't. I told him that being your parent's son means something. It means you don't get to run the math on whether keeping that person in your home is cost-effective. It means some things are not transactions. He nodded. He looked at the table. I also told him, and I want this part to be clear, because I think it matters, that I had made my own mistakes. I had moved too fast. I had signed things without reading them carefully enough. I had confused gratitude for safety and proximity for care. I had let grief make my decisions for too long. I was 67 years old, and I should have known better. And I am still working on forgiving myself for that. Some lessons cost more than others. Marcus called me the following week. He'd gotten my number from Danny. He said, "Grandpa, are you coming to Christmas?" I told him I wasn't sure yet, but that I would call before the holiday and we'd figure it out. He told me he had gotten the top grade in his class on the electrical circuits project. I told him I was proud of him. He said, "Grandpa, I want to learn more about electricity." I said, "I know a little something about that, we'll talk." I did go to Christmas. I did not stay the night. I slept in a hotel 12 minutes away, and I drove over in the morning and I sat at their table and watched Marcus and Lily open gifts. And for a few hours, it was almost like a normal family in a normal house, which it was not, but almost. Renee was quiet. She said please and thank you. She did not look at me very often. I did not require her to. After dinner, Danny walked me to my car. It was cold. Clear night. The kind of cold that makes the sky look washed. He said, "I'm glad you came." I said, "Me too." He said, "Dad, if I ask you something, will you be honest with me?" I told him I would. He said, "Are you okay?" "Really?" I thought about Paul Yetter's project site at 6:45 in the morning. My apartment with the good light. George's back porch in the evenings. The work that filled my hands and my head and left me tired in the right way at the end of the day. I said, "Danny, I'm better than I've been in a long time. Honestly." He put his hand on my shoulder. I let him keep it there for a moment. Then I got in my car and I drove back to the hotel, and I sat in the parking lot for a while before I went inside. Not because I was sad, but because I wanted to hold that moment a little longer. The cold, clear sky, the drive ahead of me, the work waiting Monday morning, the life I had rebuilt out of the rubble of 8 bad months and 1 worse year. Ruth would not have been surprised. Ruth always knew I was more capable than I gave myself credit for. I'm starting to remember that again. There are things I know now that I wish I had understood at the beginning. I know that grief is real, and it narrows your vision until you make decisions you wouldn't make with clear eyes. I know that love for your children doesn't obligate you to accept anything from them. I know that independence isn't just a financial condition, it is a state of mind. You have to protect actively, deliberately, even when you're tired, even when everything in you wants to just hand the keys to someone else and rest. Do not hand the keys to someone else. Rest, yes, but keep the keys. I know that there are people in this world, a George Abrams, a Paul Yetter, a woman in a dining room you've never met, who looks at you with more dignity than the people who are supposed to love you, who will show up for you if you let them. And I know that sometimes walking out a front door with a suitcase on a Friday morning is not the end of a story. Sometimes it is the first sentence of the one you were supposed to be living all along. I am 67 years old. I go to work on Monday mornings before 7. I know where every wire runs, and I am nobody's burden.